Welcome to Rouxbe's live event. Today, we're going to be doing behind the scenes of baking and pastry, the two courses that we've co-developed with the co-founders of the French Pastry School. And Chef Jacquy Pfeiffer is with me here again today. We've done a few of these, and it will be a very similar format in that we've picked a few key topics that students have been asking about. And Chef Jacquy is going to go into the details of troubleshooting and what to do from a master's point of view. And then we'll get into a Q&A in the afternoon. And the first thing I want to mention is housekeeping. For those of you who have not attended a live event before, we do have a Q&A section where you can enter a question, and this will be lined up in the queue that we'll get to. And if you see other questions that you like and you like to surface to the front of the line, you can heart them, and those will move up to the top. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Chef Jacquy Pfeiffer. And have him tell you a little about himself and the school. I'm Scott Samuel, Vice President of Culinary here at Rouxbe, a chef at heart, but I'm working on all things with course builds and plant-based cuisine and so forth. So welcome, Chef Jacquy. Here we are again, broadcasting some tips and techniques.
Yes, thank you, Scott. It's my pleasure to be again here for our, what is this, the fourth or fifth live event? I forgot.
I think so. But, I think I've lost count.
Yeah, right. It's so interesting, right? So a few words about me. I've been baking for the last 45 years, and I had the luck or the opportunity to work in many different parts of the world, which allowed me to see different techniques, different flavors. And then finally in 91, I landed in Chicago, and because of its beautiful weather, and I opened a French pastry school with Chef Sebastian Cannon, and this was in 1995, and we've been operating this brick and mortar school for the last 25 years, and last year we created a wonderful partnership with Rouxbe. And this is where we created the Introduction to Pastry course and a bread baking course, and soon to be a cake decorating course. So that's a few words. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's more important to answer the questions the students have about all the different topics we chose.
All right, so let's dive in. A few of you on the call I can see are already in our courses. So thanks to you for asking the key questions about tips and techniques and more detail. This kind of I know Chef Jacquy thrives on answering this, and this is kind of the driver for these live events that we've been doing. So keep the questions coming. Let's dive right into it. We're going to talk about 6 different topics today. The first one will be with regards to tempering chocolate. Then we're going to talk about making successful laminated doughs. We're going to talk about troubleshooting the macarons. We get a lot of questions on how to do it right. The cornerstone of artisan bread ingredients. We're going to go into that, a little bit about the flour, the salt, the sugar, the yeast. We're talking about starters for sourdough. And then finally, we're going to talk about canneles and how to make the batter. So the first topic is the chemistry of...
Cannelé. Sorry.
Thanks for correcting me, Chef.
French lesson of the day.
French.
Yeah.
I knew I was going to get at least one, so hopefully there's a couple more. So the first topic, Chef, the chemistry of tempering chocolate and how it works. So why don't you do a little intro, and then we can show the short clip, and then a little bit more detail on it.
Yes, the video is just a short video on to show people how to melt chocolate. And then after that, I'm going to explain what is happening between the melting part and then the cooling part.
All right, so Patrick, let's show that short clip, and then we'll dive in.
Completely melt half of the bittersweet chocolate on half power in the microwave. Then stir in the remaining bittersweet chocolate. Set it aside to cool.
All right, so what does tempering mean, Chef? And how do you do it right? And what happens if you do it wrong?
That's a loaded question, but I'll try to answer it in a short amount of time because we have 6 topics to cover. But the first thing to know is that chocolate is made of, let's take dark chocolate. It's made of cocoa butter, cocoa solids, and then sugar, and a little bit of vanilla, okay? But the main actors are cocoa butter, cocoa solids, and sugar. And those three ingredients are 100% solid. So there's no water in chocolate, okay? Chocolate should never be refrigerated, by the way. They used to do this in the 40s or 50s because in the summer things would melt, but now with air conditioning, you should not ever need to refrigerate chocolate, because refrigerating chocolate will be a bad thing, because once you pull out the chocolate from the fridge, the difference of temperature will create condensation, and then will create like a layer of humidity on top of the chocolate, and this is called water bloom. Okay, so we're not going to talk about this right now. It's just a side note, but because chocolate does not contain any water, we have different ways to melt it, but we have to be careful about it. So, for instance, if you melt it in a microwave, you need to be at half power. The reason why we use half power is because microwaves heat up food by finding the water in the food and then heating the food through the water. Well, guess what? There's no water in chocolate. So if you use 100% power on the microwave, you will burn the chocolate. And once you burn it, there's nothing you can do with it. It's awful, okay? So use 50% power if you use a microwave. If you use a double boiler, okay, also called a bain-marie, that's your second French lesson of the day, Chef Scott, then you need to make sure the bottom pan is smaller than the top bowl, because we do not want any water from the steam to go in the chocolate. Because imagine the chocolate is 100% solid. You put a drop of water in there, all of those solids are going to run for that water, right? And then the typical reaction is when this happens, people stir and they think it's going to go away by magic, and it's actually accelerating the problem, and eventually the chocolate gets thick and gets unusable for chocolate work. The best you can do is just add syrup and make a chocolate sauce or like hot whipped cream, okay? So the reason why we melt chocolate is to melt all the different particles of fat, cocoa butter fat. And at the temperature of 113 Fahrenheit, all those different particles of fat are melted, okay? Then after that, we need to cool those particles of fat to crystallize them, okay? Tempering chocolate, in my opinion, should be called crystallizing chocolate, because the cooling of the chocolate, if it's done properly, there's many techniques, but what happens, it's realigning all those different particles of fat into a pattern that assembles them, and then the chocolate will set up, okay? So I have created a small board, and it shows the chocolate that is melted at 113 Fahrenheit. That's the beginning of the process, and then after that we have to cool it. Okay, and usually we cool it by pouring it on a granite or by adding more cold chocolate. But by cooling it, the chocolate goes through a different phases of not shiny to really ugly shiny, and then finally we go down to 82 Fahrenheit, where enough cocoa butter crystals have been created, okay? Once this happens, then the chocolate will set, okay? Once you dip something in there, a chocolate dip strawberry, you dip the strawberry in there, after 2 minutes, the chocolate will set. But at 82, the chocolate will not be very shiny. So after that, what we do, we bring it up to 87, 88 Fahrenheit, okay? And then you get a very shiny chocolate with a good snap when you eat it. And then once you pour this tempered chocolate, you pour it in molds, then you get a shine that is much better because it's actually picking up the shine of the mold. So the shinier the mold, and those molds are usually made out of plastic, the shinier the mold, the shinier the chocolate. Okay, so it's a short explanation, but tempering chocolate is all about first melting all the cocoa butter crystals, then cool them in whatever way you want to. You mix a cold chocolate with the hot chocolate to cool it. You have to stir at the same time to force the cocoa butter crystals to reconnect with each other. And then once you cooled enough cocoa butter, then you bring it back up a little bit to 88 Fahrenheit until you get the proper shine.
Okay, I love the detail, and I love that chart. We need to get a screenshot of that chart to share with the team, because I've seen the numbers, but I've never seen the detail of that.
No problem.
And it's interesting what you say about the mold, where the chocolate is pulling the sheen off the shine off the mold. That's pretty interesting.
Yes.
I've always used a Bain Marie, and I've always used it where I would turn off the heat. As soon as I added the chocolate in the metal bowl on top, I was just kind of using the residual steam. Is that something you recommend when you add the chocolate to kind of bring it up slowly? Okay.
Yes, you can do that. Absolutely. It's acceptable.
Yeah, I would teach that in culinary school, because I had students melting chocolate over medium boiling water or what have you, and then come and ask me, is this right? By the time I got there, it was burnt.
Yes.
So turn off the heat.
Turn off the heat.
Okay,
you need gentle heat, you know?
What about blooming? What about when your chocolate turns white and you get that white film or the white bloom on that?
Very good question. Almost like we rehearsed it, right? In this example right here, where the chocolate is cooled to 95 Fahrenheit, you will see, and this happens sometimes at home. If you don't use air conditioning, you have chocolate sitting at home in a container, and then suddenly you hear a family member say, "Oh, the chocolate looks weird," and it gets this whitish glaze on top. It's not even a glaze; it's I don't know, finish. What happens there is, if it gets too hot in your house, or if the chocolate gets too hot, the cocoa butter that is inside the chocolate will rise to the surface. Okay? Makes a lot of sense. That's what's beautiful about pastry. Everything is explainable. So the heat in the house makes the cocoa butter rise to the top, and then after that, it gets cold again at night, right? And then that cocoa butter will seize up again, crystallize, but now it's on the surface and it's white, you know? And that's called fat bloom.
Fat bloom. So there's a great explanation. And you can heat it back up to 113 to remove the fat bloom to incorporate the cocoa butter back with the chocolate. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. A lot of people say, oh, just throw away that chocolate. Absolutely not. The chocolate, there's nothing wrong with the chocolate. All you have to do is remelt it through the same process, start all the way to 113 Fahrenheit and then cool it, and your chocolate will be perfect. And now that you talk about bloom, you started this, so and I'm going to finish it. Remember what I said about the chocolate in the fridge? So when you take that chocolate out, and you live in Hawaii, so you take it out and you don't use air conditioning, let's say. So it's like nice and warm in your house. It's like 85, let's say, and then the chocolate will go through condensation, and that condensation is now going to melt the very small particles of sugar, the crystals of sugar. It's going to melt it, okay? And then once that humidity will dry out, there's going to be some white spots that will be on the surface. They look like fat bloom, but it's not fat bloom. It's sugar bloom.
Interesting. Wow, I learned more than I expected on this tempering lesson. So
if you're not careful, you're going to learn something every day.
I care for it. So yeah, I think for the students at home, if you get the bloom, the white bloom from the cocoa or the sugar bloom, heating it back up to the 113 and proceeding with your tempering process is the way to fix it.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Chef. That was a beautiful truffle, by the way. Nice sheen.
Thank you.
Let's move to the next topic. We're going to talk about successful laminated doughs. I know we've gotten a lot of questions from the students on the courses with regards to specifically the puff pastry and the temperature of the butter and the right process. So tell us what we're going to talk about here, Chef.
Well, we're going to talk about the way the dough and the butter are rolled out and how many folds should we apply to the dough. And then lots of people fascinated about lamination, and some people say five folds, 6 folds, and they also call turns. But after the video, I'm going to show you an example, and I'm going to explain what happens when you do 4 folds, 5 folds, or 6 folds.
Okay, let's see the video, Patrick.
Okay.
Gently press the butter with your hands to secure it. Fold the bottom and the top edges of the dough over the butter. To secure, gently tap the seam. Fold the top of the dough to the center and fold the bottom of the dough over the top. This is called a single turn, which will be your first turn.
Okay, so how many turns should we do, Chef?
In my opinion, 5, but that's my opinion. And every time you ask another chef, there's another opinion.
Okay,
yeah, go ahead.
What's the number of layers? I remember when I was young learning the turns, and every turn you add a certain amount of layers. With 5 turns, how many layers are there?
I have no idea. It's a few thousand, but what are more? Well, people always wonder and they calculate and this and that. For me, what's important is for people to understand that successful lamination will take place when you have flour that is strong enough, meaning it has enough gluten. So if you make lamination at home and you use only bread flour, it can get difficult because you're rolling by hand. Nowadays, they make those hand crank machines to laminate dough. Those just came out. They're pretty nice. But if you bread flour is too strong in gluten, you'll roll out the dough and it's going to shrink back and you're going to have a hard time. Okay, so sometimes we use 2/3 bread flour, 1/3 all-purpose. Okay, that's an option for you.
Okay.
Something that has to happen is everything has to be so cold. The dough has to be super cold. The butter has to be super cold yet pliable, and then the surface has to be cold. So a trick is to put a cutting board, the largest cutting board you can find, and to put it in the freezer. And then when you roll the dough on the cutting board, you see? So the dough or the butter does not have a chance to become soft, because once those two or one of those two become soft, then they start fusing together and they become a dough. They don't become layers of dough and butter, you see? So the temperature of the dough is absolutely crucial. The colder, the better. Some people just stick it in the freezer a little bit just to be able to roll it and to not disturb those layers. Okay, so that's another thing. Then after that, how many folds should you apply? But so what I did, I rolled out puff pastry for this example, and then I rolled it and I applied 4 turns. And the photos are on my Facebook and Instagram. Chef Jacquy Pfeiffer. And then a puff pastry that is rolled to 4 turns only will rise very much, because those layers of dough and butter have not been compressed that much, right? So they'll be able to flake up. The problem with this, there's very large holes, and once you cut this, it's completely falling apart. So there's not much you can do with this puff pastry, okay? Now, if you apply 5 folds or 5 turns, you obtain something that is a little bit more compressed, yet nice and flaky. So that's why I prefer 5 folds, 5 turns. And then after that, if you go to 6, then you have something that is kind of like flattish. Is that a word, flattish? It's a word now, right? Okay, and there it's less flaky, but maybe this is what you want to do, and that's fine too. At the end, there's the rules, and then there's whatever you want to do, right? It's like everything in cooking and baking. But the key is all in the lamination. It's all about the choice of flour, and it's all about the consistency of the dough, yeah, and then patience. I know we don't have any, right? But you gotta be patient. If your dough when you roll your dough, if it's bouncing back, it's telling you that it was overworked, okay? Right. And so rest it in the refrigerator, okay?
So quick question with regards to the time in the refrigerator between turns. I knew when I was young and I had a French chef letting me do the turns. I just don't recall how long it was in the fridge. Do you do it an hour just to chill it, or is it overnight, or it's all about the texture of the dough? So what do you recommend?
Usually, well, for a home use, I would let it sit for an hour. An hour in the refrigerator. You could even try half an hour in the refrigerator, half an hour in the freezer, and this way the dough will be super cold, because as soon as it hits, it touches the table and the rolling pin, it's gonna start to get warmer, right? And for the people who really are into making puff pastry at home, croissants, and so on, I really recommend getting one of those tabletop hand crank dough sheeter, and they're not that much. I don't remember. I can provide a link. I saw one. I recommended one to a friend too, and it really changes completely the experience, because a lot of students get frustrated because the dough is stronger than them. Yeah. And so this never happens to us in commercial baking, because we have an electric dough sheeter. So the dough can fight me as long as he wants to. The machine is going to teach him a lesson, you see. But the resting, at least I would say an hour in between the folds, okay?
Okay, and I have a question that a friend of mine has. What happens if you kind of roll it and it becomes too soft and the butter rolls out? What can you do?
Oh, that's bad. Right. If the butter oozes out, you gotta. I would just put it in the fridge overnight and then just have a drink, and then the next day you look at it again, because once the butter got soft enough to ooze out, then we're talking about butter that is like, it's like at 75 degrees. That's very bad for lamination. So if you let it sit in the fridge overnight, you reset everything. It's kind of a way to reset the dough and the butter. And the next day, both of them will be again at the same temperature. And that's all. That's why I say when I started this, I said it's important that both of them are stone cold. If one of them is not stone cold, it's going to mess up the entire lamination.
Okay, so take some practice, but thanks for the input. Let's move on to the next topic, Chef. Let's talk about macarons and troubleshooting and what makes the recipe work or fail. I've seen enough questions come through with different scenarios. So tell us how to be successful.
How to be successful? Pick one recipe, and our recipe works well. Our students' work is really the testimony of the recipe. So if the majority of the student can make the macarons out of an instructional video, that means that recipe works. And this is a recipe, by the way, that comes from our school. So
Yep.
Then after that, people have to stick with that recipe and adapt. Okay, it's very important to always adapt to the recipe. And a lot of people try to do the opposite. They're like, the recipe has to adapt to me. That's not how it works. If your environment is too humid, if you live in a tropical climate, I get that question a lot, and you're supposed to dry the nut powder and the sugar at room temp, it's not going to work. Okay, so what you have to do, you have to put a dehumidifier in a closet, and you create your little drying room, right? Or you put it near a furnace or something. You got to figure it out to make sure that you treat the recipe the way it wants to be treated. Yeah.
Yep. So, question about the folding. So you've got the dry sugar nut powder, and then you've whipped your egg whites and made a meringue, and then you're adding it in 3 additions. Is it important to do the folding technique so that you're not deflating the egg whites, or is that okay to do with this type of
yeah,
pastry?
you have to fold it to incorporate the egg white, and then after that there is another stage that is called macaroni. That's your 3rd French lesson of the day, Chef Scott. Macaroni, and
Did
it's
you say
not macaroni.
Macaroni? Isn't that Italian, macaroni?
Of course you would say that. You're Italian, right? So macaroni is to over mix a little bit the egg white, and what happens then, the batter gets a little bit softer. Okay, and the way to see if you mixed it enough, once you're done mixing it, you just put a little bit of batter on the surface of the batter, just a tip, and you watch it, and it should kind of like melt in the batter in about 20-30 seconds. That means you mixed it enough. Okay, if you create a little tip and it's not moving, then you need to give it another couple, 2-3 folds. Okay.
Okay. And did you have a little bit of show and tell for us today?
Yes. Did you show the video already?
Oh no, let's do the video. Thank you. Let's show the video.
Show the video?
Patrick. Yeah, I do.
Whip until the egg whites become a stiff meringue. Gently fold in the dry mixture into the meringue in 3 additions.
Okay, so that's what I was referencing to, the deflating the egg meringue too much by folding. You got to be pretty careful there, right?
You got to be careful, yeah. And the problem is if you overfold it, there is no way to turn things back. You just turn it into soup, and we're not making soup, Chef Scott. We're making macarons, So that's the key. That's why I say give it another 2 folds. Do another test and see if it works, because once you overfold it, there's nothing you can do with it. And then another thing that is important is to grind the nut powder in a very fine grain, because and in our recipe we asked the students to grind the nut powder and the confectionery sugar together in a blender for, I think it's about 30 seconds. I don't remember what's in the recipe. And then after that, we put it on a sheet tray and we let it dry overnight. And then the next day we grind it again, because the finer the nut grain, the more each little grain is going to absorb and retain moisture. That's why, if you have big pieces of almonds, they are going to absorb moisture, but the center has not had a chance to be absorbed. Okay, so the finer the nut powder, the better. Okay, and then there's this question of aging egg white, which means you put the egg white in a shallow pan, and you let it air out for in the fridge, for 24 hours. And I calculated once, and for every 24 hours, you lose about 10% water in the egg white. Okay, and what this does, it makes an egg white that is more concentrated in protein, and it makes the meringue hold its shape much more. Okay.
So it's important to age it uncovered in the refrigerator, correct?
Yeah, yeah, because if you cover it, it cannot evaporate, That's
right.
what you did, right? Didn't you? So
no, I did it uncovered. I just want to make sure the students know.
Sure. And then there is the whole baking aspect. There's the recipe, and then there's everybody's oven, and everybody's oven is different. We have 4 convection ovens here that are the same brand, and guess what? They all bake slightly differently. Okay, so that's the nature of ovens, and we just need to adapt to the oven, make sure they are well calibrated, but then we need to adapt to the recipe. So I brought some macarons. So the macaron that I'm holding right now is completely flat, so it does not have what we call a foot. Okay. And that's due to an oven that is not hot enough. So this is probably an oven that is 280 Fahrenheit. Okay, the reason why it did not rise up is because the more heat you inject in this macaron, the more the water in the macaron is going to turn into steam and quickly push up the macaron shell. Yeah. So this is an oven that is too cold, right? And then another. So let's say you are at 290. Okay, just an example. Okay, I don't want people to say, okay, 290 is my temperature. No, it's just I'm explaining what happens. So when you have an oven that is slightly warmer but still not hot enough, what happens? It creates somewhat of a foot, and it makes the shell rise more than the first guy, but what we have is now a hollow shell, because the shell will rise, but the center was not heated enough to rise, and then it creates this separation. Okay, so you need to be this is still not hot enough. This hot enough to make it rise, but still not hot enough to make the center rise. You see? So if this is my oven, if this is 290 and the first one was 280, I should be around 300. And what's important is to make the macaron rise the first 2-3 minutes. So a lot of chefs, they use maybe 310, let's say, for the first 2-3 minutes. Once the macarons are up and they have a foot, then they can turn down the heat and then continue to bake the macarons so they don't get any color. And the last thing that I want to say is that what you pipe the macaron on is very important, because a lot of people use parchment paper, which is fine, but if you have macarons that are misshaped like this, those were piped on parchment paper. Okay, and depending on the parchment papers, some parchment papers contain more silicone, no silicone, some wax, no wax, and this and that. It can affect the shape of the macaron, because the macaron cannot spread. If you have no silicone in this paper, the macaron will stick on the paper, and the base will stick while the rest wants to expand. You see? So again, what I recommend to people who love to make macaron, stick with one recipe and adapt around the recipe. Okay? Don't change the recipe around because the macarons did not come out. You might have to adapt your oven. You have to adapt your parchment paper or a silicone mat, but you have to adapt around the recipe. Okay, because if you start changing the recipe, then it's like walking in the dark woods. You're not gonna know what you're gonna find, because the recipe is, let's say you remove a little bit of sugar just because, and the recipe is gonna react differently, but you have no idea really what made that change. Is it the sugar in contact with the parchment, in the baking, and so on? So it's better to stick with the recipe and then work around it. Okay.
Well, everything you wanted to know about macarons. Now that you've made them, and I know the recipe online. So for those of you who have not joined any of our courses. Introduction to Pastry Arts is about 60 hours. Bread Baking Arts is about 80 hours. And a lot of the units are incorporated with places for you to actually execute a recipe and take pictures of it and upload it for Chef Jacquy and his team to actually grade it. So macarons is one of those lessons. What happens after I make the macaron? I know it makes about 60 for that recipe. How do I store them so that I don't eat them all in one day?
Well, again, you have to be patient, Chef Scott. So after they have been, because macarons, after they have macaron shells, we call them shells, after they have been baked, they are kind of hard, not super hard, but they're hard. And once they are filled, then those shells need to get moist again. And so what we do, we put them in the refrigerator anywhere from 24 to 48 hours, because again, every refrigerator is different. You know that some refrigerators contain 70%, 80%, 90% humidity, okay? And so some chefs tell me, oh, I just let them rest 12 hours, and another chef 24 hours, another one is 48 hours. That all depends on the recipe and the humidity in their fridge. So what this humidity will do, it will soften again the shell, yeah? And then at this point, you can eat them after, let's say, 48 hours if you have that patience. And but you have also the choice to freeze them, yeah? So first you have to mature them, then you have to freeze them. Then you can freeze them, okay? Don't freeze them first because they're not mature, right? They have not softened. Freezing is not going to soften them, you know?
All right, Chef. On a scale of 1 to 10, how hard do you think this recipe is for a beginner baker to jump in and make these?
Oh, it's a 10. It's fine. You know, again, I have lots of people, lots of students who made macaron for the first time. We graded some yesterday or before yesterday, and they say it's the first time, and they're like, oh yeah, this recipe is pretty easy. And I'm like, okay, great. And while others, but it's like everything, you know, some people, they do better in macaron, others do better in croissant, and it's just completely different way of thinking, you know. Those are completely different animals. But this recipe, if you follow it, there's no reason why it should not work.
All right. Well, thank you, Chef. So we have 3 more topics I want to talk about. The next one is the cornerstone of bread ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast, and how they interact with each other.
Yes.
So would you want to start with the video, Chef, and then we can
Sure. Go ahead.
Chat on that? All right. Patrick?
Make a well on the work surface with the flour and place the salt, yeast, and malt inside. Then pour in the pouliche. Passage en tête the dough using both hands. Clip the dough with your thumb and index finger and stack the pieces on top of each other.
So what's that technique that's not kneading? Tell us a little bit about that before you can dive into it.
Yeah, well, it's not, and it's called no knead bread, right? It's a play on word, but it means that you just put the flour, water, yeast, and salt in a bowl, and you just let it do its thing, which eventually the water is going to get to the gluten and is going to make the dough a little bit elastic, you know. And usually you just mix it a little bit just to get things going, to get the gluten activated and elastic. But it's not the type of bread that you put on the table and that you fold and knead it.
Okay. So why don't you explain the function of all the different ingredients and how they play together to make successful bread?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and we had a lot of fun writing the bread course because there's so much to talk about. Just those 4 ingredients, we could talk about it for 8 hours. But in a nutshell, you need flour, bread flour, to make bread. That is around 11 to 13% of protein. Protein meaning gluten. Okay, gluten is what make the dough hold its shape. It's gluten. I always tell my students, gluten, imagine in your head, it's powdered rubber bands, okay? It's just a powder, but it's rubber band, okay? And as soon as you add water and friction, this powder will fuse together into one rubber band, okay? And so the flour is very important. If the flour does not have enough gluten, like if you, for some reason, you just feel like you're gonna make bread with pastry flour or cake flour, it's not gonna work because you're gonna shape dough and it's gonna flatten again. And shape it again, it's gonna flatten again. You can do that all day long. It's not going to hold its shape because what holds the entire structure in shape is the gluten, okay? It's those rubber bands, okay? So you need a flour that is high in gluten, bread flour, and then after that, the flour has to be ideally organic or non-bromated, non-bleached, all of those things that will affect the fermentation of the yeast. Imagine if you have a flour that is bleached and you're trying to make a sourdough. That bleach is going to be very bad for the starter because the starter is a living soul, and that bleach is pretty much gonna not kill it, but it's going to like slow it down. Okay, so use flour that is very natural, and many of our students they go to a local flour mill and they get flour like this, or they make their own flour, which you have to be careful because the home machines to make flour, they will not give you a grain that is as fine. Okay, it's the same thing because flour is full of starch, and what is that starch going to do, Chef Scott?
It's going to absorb the moisture.
It's going to, yes, exactly. Like I said, I always tell my students, everything is in front of you. If you just put two and two together, you'll see that the starch in the flour is what's absorbing the water in the dough. Okay, gluten also absorbs water, but there's much more starch than gluten in the flour, and so. If you flour grain, the particles are very thick because you did it yourself, or the local flour mill is very artisanal and it's kind of like rough. It's not going to absorb the water the same way or as well as flour that is finer. Okay, so that's on the flour side, and like I said, we could talk 8 hours on the flour, but we have only so much time, right? And so since we talked about the water has to be clean water. Tap water is fine, but sometimes hard water, depending on your water and on the filter, whatnot. Sometimes if the water is too hard, it will affect the fermentation. So you gotta make sure that is not a problem. A lot of professional bakers, they have a special filter on the water and they set it so they get it to the pH that they want. And then you have the yeast, which is what brings everything to life. We use dry yeast because it's very convenient. Fresh yeast, you can find it sometimes in the supermarket, but how long has it been sitting on the shelf there? Who knows? 1 week, 3 weeks, a month, nobody knows. And sometimes you open it, it looks funky, and then you try to make bread, and then we get the comment, it's not working for me. That's because the yeast is dead. So we use dry yeast because it's the same product as fresh yeast, but just they remove the water, and this way we can control the bread much better. And then the water will feed the yeast, okay? And then the yeast is going to create carbon dioxide and make the dough rise, okay? And then lastly, we have the police of the bread, which is the salt, okay? The salt is an acid, and that acid, if you put too much salt in a bread by mistake, that bread will never rise because it killed the yeast, or at least it slowed it down way too much, right? And not enough salt will make the dough rise out of control because there's no police. There's no police there, and the yeast is like, oh, we can do whatever we want to, And and so the salt is very important. We like to use sea salt because we feel it's a little less salty than rock salt, but everybody can do whatever they want, But the amount of salt, you have to be careful, and that's why the recipes in the bread programs are those are handpicked because we show so many different ways of fermenting bread. In this program, there's bigat, there's poulish, levain, there is fermented dough, there's direct method. So many different fermentation methods and different breads, but those recipes, we make them here on a daily basis and they work. So again, keep those recipes the way they are and then adapt around the recipes, okay?
Excellent. Well, we could go on for another 7.5 hours.
Yes.
But let's move on to sourdoughs, sourdough starters, and naturally fermented starters. And this is a little bit different than the dry yeast and the fresh yeast. So let's discuss sourdough. You want to run the video and then we can discuss?
Yes.
Okay, Patrick.
The final temperature of the dough should be 73 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Some bread starters use naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria from flour and water. This becomes a living starter and requires regular feedings in order for it to stay active.
All right, so tell me about starters and how often do you feed your starter and what's the importance of keeping your starter alive?
Yes, so starter is also a very hot topic. People love to make their own starter, and you can create a starter with many different things. But we make it with we start first with wheat flour and or rye flour and water, and then there is a small amount of salt, and if you want, sorry, and then what the water is going to do, it's going to soften the flour, and the natural wild yeasts that are sitting in the flour are going to start to come to life, okay? So after 24 hours, you usually don't see much of a reaction, And then the next day you take an amount of this starter and you feed it again with fresh flour. That fresh flour contains more wild yeast and more water. The water feeds those wild yeast, and we slowly start the fermentation, just like many other fermentation, kombucha, beer, you name it. It's always the same thing. You need to build the culture, okay? And every day you feed it with new water and flour, okay? And usually after 5 days, you have a starter that is bubbly and that is alive. And the way to know that is you look at it, and Jeff is going to try to show it. I don't know if you see it. It's super bubbly, and if you smell it, it smells very good. It smells tangy, but not foul, okay? And everybody who makes a starter names it. So this is our starter. We call it Scotty, okay? And then he's my best friend. And but then after that, you're supposed to feed it once a day, especially if you use it in production. But if you don't use it in production, you can let it sit in the refrigerator for 3 to 5 days. Okay, our master baker here, Chef Julian, he likes to push it to the limit. Okay, and but the problem is if you forget to feed it, it's like everything. It's like a puppy. If you forget to feed it, it's going to die, right? So it's terrible to say, but that's how it is. You got to feed your starter, okay? And then if you don't feed it, it turns. I don't know if you see that. This is a starter. We let it go bad, so it starts to turn grayish, and it's completely liquidy. It's not bubbly anymore, and this is what it looks like, you know. So it's very sad, okay? But this guy, depending on how dead it is, it might be completely dead, or we might take a portion of this and mix it with new flour and new water, and we might bring it back to life. But this one is do you see this, Jeff? You see it, Jeff? Okay. So the bubbles are the indicator, and then after that the smell. It's got a smell, like you say, tangy, a very good sour smell, and then also the color has to be like a grayish, a light brownish, and that's an indicator that your starter is alive and kicking. And you can keep it forever as long as you feed it, okay? And in our bread program, we have a much longer explanation where we show you how to make a starter, how to keep it, and then there's also a dry starter, so less water. And what's the advantage of this? If there's less water, then it's not going to develop so quickly, and you can keep it longer, okay?
I have a couple questions, Chef. First one, do you ever do the water test where you take a little bit amount of starter and put it in the water to see if it floats? Or are you just noticing that it's fine at that texture? Okay.
No, we don't do that. We are because after a while you just and you're gonna think I'm joking, but after a while you develop a relationship with your starter, because you every morning in production, or if you make bread at home or on the weekend, you expect it to be rising, and it's right there, and it's ready to go. And then every time you make bread, the bread rises the way you want to. It's like me. I've been making kombucha for a long time now, and I can play around with that fermentation, and I can push it. Sometimes I don't feed it for 2-3 weeks, and it's still there and alive. Right. So the longer you feed it, the stronger it gets, and you should not have a problem. You know, sometimes people say, "Oh, starters, that's not for me." It's probably a step that was missed somewhere, but anybody can make a starter. Okay.
So since we had our first live event, when I was talking about my starter back last summer, I've shared my starter with a couple people, and both of them are making it on a regular basis, and they have strong relationships with their starters.
That's your private life, you know. I mean, seriously.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the last topic, which is a great dessert, canellis. Can you tell us about the canellis making and the batter and a few things about that? Because I know it's a wonderful dessert when it's done right.
Yes, you want to show the video first or after?
Yeah, let's play the video, Patrick.
Okay.
It is that simple. The authentic copper molds do all the work for you.
So a quick video, but let's talk about how to make the batter and how to age the batter and what's the difference.
So the batter is usually made with pastry flour, which is a flour that does not contain too much gluten. It's a little above cake flour. And again, the flour has to be very fine, right? Remember, we said that in the bread, in the little bread discussion we had. The finer the flour, the more the starch can absorb the moisture, right? So it's the same thing. That's why pastry can always be explained, and that's why after a while, our students are like, wait a minute, I know why this is happening. It's because of that. Everything is related, okay? So
Right.
here it's the same thing. Fine flour, okay? And then you mix it with the ingredients. There is milk, there is eggs, because it's actually an egg-based mixture. You need the egg to hold it all together. And then the secret weapon is the rum, okay? And make it without rum and make it with rum, and you're going to see that the ones with rum are much better. There's some things in pastry and in cooking that some flavors go really well together, okay? And this was not created by me or you, chef, or other chef. This was created by people's palate over hundreds of years, right?
Right.
After hundreds of years, they decided that apple pie with vanilla ice cream goes the best, right? It's not apple pie with I don't know, mint
Rum
chocolate
raisin.
chip ice cream. Or no, rum raisin actually would work, bad example. But what I'm trying to get at is the rum really makes a difference. It's the same thing if you put a touch of rum in the almond cream, it's a completely different animal, and for some reason it works. Also, other things that work with almond cream is cherry Kirschwasser,
Yep.
which is made from cherries. Okay, and it goes really well. That flavor goes really well with almonds. Okay, so the rum does a really great job at adding that extra flavor, and people are like, "Oh my God, I cannot feed those cannoli to my kids." And that rum will be sitting in the butter for 48 hours. It will be completely evaporated, and whatever is left in there, the alcohol, will be evaporated completely in the oven. They are baked at 425, I believe. Very hot.
Okay.
So there's gonna be zero alcohol in this cannoli, but the flavor of rum will be there. So the reason why we let this sit for 48 hours is two reasons. The starch will have 2 days to absorb the moisture, okay? And this is what makes a cannoli super moist, almost custard-like in the center, okay? And also what happens is after 48 hours, the gluten in the dough will, I don't want to say it's giving up, but it's fading, okay? The strength of the gluten is fading, okay? So
Isn't the gluten denatured a little bit by the alcohol? Is that
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
You get 10 points for that,
Thanks.
out of 100.
Oh.
And then you have the molds. You can use silicone molds because they are very convenient. And when you use silicone molds, you do not need to treat them with hot wax and oil because they're silicone. Nothing sticks to silicone. But really, if you are like becoming a fanatic about macarons, you get copper molds like this, and if you buy them, sometimes you find them on eBay or places like this for not too much. And actually, if they are used, it's better because they already have been cured. Yeah, they have been used, seasoned, and enough oil got inside the metal. Okay, so those, and if you have a chance before you buy them to lift them, they should feel heavy. Okay, cheap versions feel very, very light. So the cannoli mold is made with copper on the outside. So the copper is there to transfer the heat.
Right.
And then the inside is a thin layer of tin. Okay, that makes it a metal that where you can pour butter in there. You cannot have butter touching the copper because you might get an oxidation and you might get people sick. Okay, and then but once you have those molds, you will have them for life. Okay, absolutely for life. I never heard anybody who was like, oh, those molds, they're not good anymore. It's like, you cannot destroy them, even if you bake candies every day in them. Okay, so that's the beauty of it. It's a one-time investment, and in the quality molds, and then you can make the candies as many times as you want to. Now, for the baking part, I get this question a lot. Some people they bake them too much or not enough, and that's again the relationship you have with your oven. You need to adapt your oven to the candies. Okay, we can only push it so far with the instructions, because your oven might have a mind on its own. It might be very hot for no reason, and mine might be colder. So I have to do something about it and make that candy recipe over and over again until they come out, because every time I change one thing. By the way, if you change something, you can only do one experiment at a time. You cannot change the butter and increase the heat, and then you have a different result, and you're like, okay, great, but I have no idea what created that different result. You're back to square one.
Right.
Oops. So adapt the oven to your project. I was watching our student Ivy, who was making, it's completely off topic, but she was making the puff pastry, the long puff pastry pie with spinach in there. She made it 4 times, and every time the pie would explode, and explode mean it would burst open, because there's too much. There was too much moisture in the spinach. Spinach is like vegetable, and fruit is 90 plus
90% water.
Yeah, 90% water. It's all water. So if you don't cook that water or dry it out enough, that water will be sitting there, and as soon as it gets heated in the oven, it's gonna turn to steam, and it's gonna make the whole thing explode. So she adapted not only the baking, but she adapted the spinach filling, and until it was dry enough, and then after the 4th time she made it. So now her and her family is gonna eat spinach pie until Christmas, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So
I saw the student. I'm glad that they figured that out.
Adapt to the recipe, especially if you have a good recipe and you have good molds. There's no reason why those candies cannot come out, because we have students that make them really well, and other students where the candy is not baked enough, or they have a big hole in the center. That means, again, it's just like the macaron. There was not enough heat, and the batter didn't have a chance to rise up. You see, it's always the same. It's always the same story. It's all about baking, steam, also air bubble expansion. At the end of the day, adapt to the recipe, and then you will see eventually you have it. And once you have it, you have to lock it down. You cannot be like, okay, today I feel different, I'm gonna make it different. That works only on TV, and it's not even real, right? It's like, oh, I have no ingredients, I have no scale, I'm just gonna throw things together and voila. Well, yeah, that's great, but that's not reality, right? Once you have a good recipe, lock it in and don't change it ever again.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the feedback that you're giving students is based on those that recommendation right there. Our recipe has been tested for our kitchen, but we need to adapt it for your kitchen. And what are you going to do with your oven, and what are you going to do with your timing, and the moisture in the refrigerator, and all those details?
Guess what? When I make a recipe from the program in my home oven, I don't have fancy pans or I don't even have a fancy oven, right? I'm like, the oven was there when I bought the condo, so I'm like, okay, and then I have to adapt. And then after a while, I know that this recipe works really well in that oven at that temperature. And then after so much time, I have to lower the temp, or have to rotate the pans. I mean, I have to adapt. Okay.
You're learning. All right, Chef, let's move into the Q&A. But before we go, I have a little bit of footage of you and I making truffles together way back when. Thank you, Patrick, for that surprise for both of us. It's always fun.
Beautiful.
All right, Chef, let's move on to some questions. We've got a few here. I'm going to start with the one on the top. So this comes from Virginia, and it's if you're tempering chocolate when the weather is humid, what can you do to be successful with this challenge? And it's just a three-part question. So,
yeah, I worked in very humid countries. I worked in Asia for 4 years, and it was very bad. So what we did, we would do all our chocolate work in a small room. Doesn't have to be a big room, but that room had an air conditioner in there 24/7, because it would dry out the humidity in the air to about 50%. Okay, so that's a minimum, and so that's what I would recommend for Virginia. Pick a small room somewhere in your house, and doesn't have to be big, but that's where you do your chocolate work. Okay, and once the chocolates are made and they stay in that room, then you package them, and then whatever you do with them, you sell them or you give them away, but they have to stay in that room until they go out of the room, because if the rest of the house is humid and hot, we don't want those chocolates to be sitting there in that environment. Okay.
Yeah, I have a story real quick. Another recommendation is to do it later at night or early in the morning when it's the temperature is down and the humidity is down. I spent some time at the French Laundry years ago, and Chef Stephen Durfee, the pastry chef, had to do the chocolates every other week from midnight to 6 in the morning, when one, the kitchen was empty, two, it was cool enough in Napa Valley to do this, and the humidity was low enough to actually do it without having issues.
They don't have air conditioning at the French Laundry?
No, they didn't back in '98 in the kitchen.
Probably not in the kitchen. Usually the kitchens, restaurant kitchens are super hot. So yeah, that's a way to do it. Work at midnight and then have fun being alone in the kitchen, and then make your chocolates, and c'est la vie, huh? Right?
All right. Next question from Virginia is, what brand of chocolate do you recommend when you're working for making truffles?
We recommend, we use exclusively Guitar chocolate. It's a very user-friendly chocolate, and they have many different types of white, milk, and dark chocolate. And at the end, chocolate is finicky already the way it is. And so if you have a user-friendly chocolate, you should stick with it, okay? The worst thing you do is you use different types of chocolate for different types of recipes. You're never gonna stop having problems, because every manufacturer makes chocolate just like people make wine. They all have a different way to do it. It's all chocolate at the end, but the cocoa butter was treated differently, and so on. The amount is less or more. So stick with one brand, because it comes out from the same factory, the same process, and again, adapt to the chocolate.
Okay. What was that brand again, Chef?
Guitar chocolate.
Oh, Guitar, yes. All right, and her third question of a three-part series here is, what's your yeast preference, fresh or dry?
Dry is our preference. I use fresh for a long time back in France, but then I started to travel in warm countries, and no way you could use fresh yeast, because it would just, it's the same thing. You live in a tropical climate, and your storeroom or the fridge might be cold, not cold, and the yeast would die. So we would always use dry yeast. Okay, remember, it's the same product. Dry yeast and fresh yeast is the same product at the base. To make dry yeast, they remove the water in the fresh yeast. Okay, and to convert fresh yeast to dry yeast, if you have 100 grams of fresh yeast, and then you want to use dry yeast, you divide the 100 gram by 2.5. Okay, and then you get the weight of dry yeast. Okay.
Good information. All right, next question with regards to sourdough. I've been making breads for about 7 years at home and find that my crumb tends to have small and homogeneous holes. What do I need to do to have larger or uneven holes? And by the way, the sourdough starter is 7 years old too.
Okay. Three things you could do is put a little bit more water in your dough, because the water will make the dough looser, a little bit looser, and allow those air bubbles to grow bigger. Yeah, that's one thing. Don't overmix the dough, because the more you mix the dough, the more you compress all the air in the dough. Okay, so don't overmix it. So maybe undermix it a little bit. And the third thing is, when you fold the loaves on the table, don't fold them too tight, because the tighter you shape the dough, the more you compress whatever air bubbles are in there. Okay? All right.
All right, thanks. Next question: is it possible to prepare healthy breads and pastries following the whole food plant-based way of eating? So it is possible. I know that our courses with the French Pastry School are focused on the classic technique. And I also know that tomorrow Chef Fran is doing essential vegan desserts and can answer this a little bit more detail in terms of the amount of oil or no oil or such. Did you want to add anything, Chef?
No, I think you did it well. We focus on the classic techniques, but many of our students take our program because they want to learn the techniques, because I always say technique is king. Once you know how things interact with each other in a recipe, you can then transfer those techniques into vegan and whatever you want it to be, healthier, right? Less sugar and this and that. Once you understand the function of each ingredient, then you can play around, okay? But if you don't have those techniques, you don't know, right? You change a recipe or you try a recipe and it's not working, but you have no idea why. It's like me. I don't like to work on my car. I don't like the smell of it, the engine and all this. So if my car breaks down, I'm not going to try to like move things, unplug things, because I have no clue. So learning the technique will give you the tools to then after that adapt different kind of flours, sugars, fats, right? Because even if, let's say, if you laminate dough with a vegan butter, it will work. It will work because butter, if it's the same amount of fat, at least 82%, lamination is lamination. It will work. But if you don't know how to laminate, you won't be able to do anything. Okay?
All right, a couple more questions with regards to is it possible to convert a traditional bread recipe to plant-based or vegan from Josette? Well, a traditional bread recipe having flour, water, salt, and yeast would be vegan and plant-based to get going. But other quick breads that might have butter or eggs in it, once again, Essential Vegan Desserts, one of our programs, and Chef Fran will be live tomorrow. She can answer some of those questions.
Yes. Yeah, and we touched on this. We have one unit in the bread program where we make vegan quick breads and gluten-free quick breads. Everything is possible if you know how to treat the ingredients, if you know their function in the recipe.
Right. Okay, moving on. A question here from Emma. I'm looking for a gluten-free and dairy-free recipe for bread that can be made by hand and maybe another for a bread machine. Thank you.
That's another question.
Chef, what do you think about
Chef Fran? Huh?
Yeah, gluten-free and dairy-free. I know that it's possible. I know that the gluten-free unit that we do have doesn't dive into it as deep as Essential Vegan Desserts. And Chef Fran can help with that, Emma.
Yes.
All right, this is from Susan. Due to family health concerns, I have to switch to gluten-free. I've tried a few breads, but they're crumbly and dry. Can you offer some tips on successful gluten-free breads? Kind of another similar question. Chef Jacquy, do you know Chef Richard Kopej? I think that's his last name.
Yes.
He worked for the CIA for years. He has a great cookbook, Gluten-Free Baking.
Yes,
and he has multiple blends in the back of it. So Gluten-Free Baking, a great cookbook. I think it was published about 15 years ago. Chef Richard, I would reference that book.
But at the end, if things are crumbling, there's two things that are happening. You don't have enough moisture product, and you have nothing to hold the solids together. Yeah, in gluten-free and such, you can use lecithin, you can use psyllium, you can use many different xanthan gum, you can use many things to bind the ingredients together, which is what gluten does, right? So if you don't have that, if you don't have a gluten, you got to replace it with something that does the same function. Okay.
Yep. You know, one tip I've done is I put ground flaxseed meal into my muffins in order to give that structure, so they're not so crumbly and flat. That's a quick fix on my end.
I agree with you, but then you have the taste factor, because anything you add to a recipe is going to taste the same, right? So for me, when I put too much flaxseed, especially ground flaxseed, it gets kind of like an aftertaste of fishy, you know? And
that's true. Yep.
Me personally, it really bothers me, but that's just me. So I try to get my binding from different things than ground flaxseed. But at the end, everybody can do whatever they want to.
Okay. We do have another question from this one's from Darlene. Can you suggest a simplistic healthy bread for a forks over knife program? I know we have a forks over knife program. I don't know if we go into the simple healthy bread in there.
I don't know.
Yeah, I would have to get back to you, Darlene. I'm going to make note on that. Moving on to Sylvia. Hi, is it possible to use only baking soda instead of baking powder? So there is a difference between the two. Chef, you want to answer that question?
Yes.
Is it possible to only use baking soda?
Yes, you could. It all depends on what you're making. Baking soda is an alkaline, so it's the opposite of acidic, right? Of acid, and so baking soda is usually used in lemon pound cakes. Okay, let's say good example. So the acid will make the baking soda foam. Those bubbles create gas, and the gas wants to expand and makes the product rise. Beautiful. But what if I make a cake that is not acidic, and then it's not acidic, not very much acidic, just a little bit, and then I have only baking soda? What will happen is only a very little bit of acid is going to activate that baking soda, and your pound cake is going to rise just a little bit. What you need is the other leavening agents that are in baking powder. Okay, baking powder is made of baking soda and some other leavening agents. Okay, so that's why you need baking powder for pound cakes or quick breads that are not very acidic. That's why you use one or the other. So I would try to recommend to find both and use both when it's called for. But baking soda usually for acid mixtures.
Okay. So to add to this, we have a question from Vicky, very similar. Can you talk about the difference between the baking soda and powder, which you noted, and then the amount of yeast in bread making? So I would assume that baking soda and baking powder are for quick breads, and yeast would be specifically for artisan bread making, correct?
Yes. The amount of yeast in bread making, it's not a one recipe fits all, because it all depends how long you let things mature, the dough mature. My father was a baker, and he would make, 200 pounds of dough, right? He would make this at 5 p.m., sorry. Mm-hmm. And then I would see him put a very small amount of yeast, and I would ask myself, how can this rise? But what would happen, he would then, after the mixing, he would cover this dough and he would let it rise naturally for 7 hours. It's kind of like a dough/starter. So you see, the longer the fermentation, the smaller amount of yeast you need to put in there, because remember, you have also the natural, you have also Scotty coming in play, and the natural yeast will come in effect and help with the rising. Okay, so there's no one answer fits all, unfortunately.
All right, Chef. Moving on, I'm going to go into, I have a bread machine and I use it to make a loaf of bread. It's okay, but the sides and bottom of the bread usually come out hard. I've never made bread in the oven, but I want to try. Any suggestions on how to get started to avoid hard crusts? I mean, my first suggestion would be to go to the toast bread unit and our introduction to pastry arts and get started on cooking in the oven.
My suggestion is to get rid of the bread machine. I have nothing against bread machines, but let's take the baguette recipe that we have in our program. This is a dough that is entirely made by hand. Okay, entirely made by hand. You mix it, you beat it up. Our students are working very hard on this. You could of course do it with a mixer. Okay. And then after that, you let the dough rise naturally, okay? Or you can also use our way to ferment dough into an unturned, a cold oven where we put a pan of hot water, and it creates a warm environment. It creates a proofer, a fermenting chamber, okay? So this becomes one function the bread machine does. And then after that, the baking, in my opinion, should be done in an oven, because you get this very strong heat, and then the dough will have a chance to rise, and then the dough will have a chance to get a great color, you know? So you should try to set the bread machine aside, and then try to make bread by hand or by mixer, and then proof it, ferment it, and then bake it in an oven. Okay, and I guarantee you, the result is gonna be much better.
All right, we have a few more questions in this line of thought here. This is from Jocelyn. When making bread dough, how do you keep it from getting higher than the recommended 73 to 77 degrees? By the time she gets a good gluten window, the temp is higher. Bread works out, but temp must make a difference. So thank you. If it's going to come higher than 77, still might work out. But what's the difference?
So what happens is, and I get this question here and there. Sometimes the final dough temperature is warmer than what we recommend, and this can be for many different things. The environment in the kitchen is warmer than it should. And also there's the friction of the mixer, okay? Every mixer mixes differently. The dough hook might create more or less friction, okay? And so my recommendation is if your dough is a little bit warmer than it should be, decrease the base temperature by 1 or 2 degrees, okay? So let's say if in our recipe the base temperature is 62 Celsius, make the dough with 61, okay? And then you should be with 1 degree less, you should be 3 degrees colder at the end of the mixing, okay? And then you see what happens. And if it's still a little bit too warm, then you go to 60 Celsius base temperature. And eventually you'll find the sweet spot. And again, we're adapting the recipe to the environment, the mixer, and so on, okay? But cool the base temperature down, and then you will see it will work.
Yep, base temperature. There's a whole unit on the base temperature, Jocelyn, in our course. So we have a question here from Vicky. The flours I use to make bread have different gluten-forming protein content. What's the significance of these percentages, and can I combine these any way I want to and still have a good loaf of bread? So this is great to talk about pastry flour, cake flour, AP flour, bread flour, and the different percentages.
So we want to combine flours, right? For bread making? Yep. Is it for bread making? Yeah?
Yeah, for making bread, you know, we could say, you know, 50% AP, 50% bread flour, or what might you say?
No, you cannot do that. You can, if you want to make bread, we're talking about artisan bread, you have to stay with different types of bread flours, okay? And because if you start to put all-purpose flour has about 9%, let's say, protein, depends on the flour
Right.
mill. And we're looking for anywhere from 11 to 13. So what's going to happen, that's going to be a bread that will not hold its shape, okay? So don't mix cake, pastry, or all-purpose flour with bread flour to make artisan bread. It does not work, okay? Then after that, if you want to make a rye bread or like a whole wheat bread, those flours don't have as much gluten as bread flour. So you add a certain amount, 20% of, you change 20%, let's say, of bread flour with rye flour, and then you make the dough. You will see that the dough is softer. It feels stickier. Why? It's because it's not holding together, yeah? And then usually those loaves are all baked in a mold because they cannot hold their shape really well, or they will always be a little flattish, you know? We have a whole wheat bread in the program that's baked in a mold, and then we have some rye breads that will always be a little flatter than a dough that is made just with bread flour.
Okay. Coming to the next question here, Chef. Thank you. Making bread in my Thermomix. The yeast taste comes through very strongly. When I do bread by hand, it doesn't. What is the cause when the yeast taste comes through? This is from Ingela. I think I'm pronouncing that right. So Thermomix, have you ever heard of making bread in a Thermomix, Chef?
No, I have not. But in Europe, they do that a lot. And the only reason why yeast smells stronger is because the dough got overheated. I guarantee you, if what is her name, Angela? Yeah, if she takes the temperature of the dough, it's going to be way above 77 Fahrenheit that we recommend. It's about 23 to 25 Celsius. And if yeast gets overheated, it ferments too quickly, and bad gases will come out. Okay, those are gases that are not the tangy gases that you were describing. Those are foul gases. That means things got overheated. Okay.
Okay. Next question from Pilar. What is bleached flour used for? Simple.
Oh, you can use bleach flour for any bread baking, you know, but I don't like to put bleach in my system. And so anybody can bake bread with bleach flour. It will work. It will not. The bread will not always rise the same way, but it works fine. Okay. At the end, it's a question of what kind of flour you want to eat, what kind of bread you want to make, the cost, you know, because it's usually flour mills. They bleach flour, they treat flour, they bromate it also. They treat the flour so the flour will have a longer shelf life, and they will have everybody will have a flour that will last longer, all the way down to the baker, right? Nobody wants to have flour that is going bad. You know that there's about 14% water in flour, Chef Scott. So flour is alive. It's completely alive. It's raw. And so if you bleach it, it will last much longer. Okay?
Okay, great, Chef. Coming down to the very end of our questions here, we have a question here from Pixie. The best sourdough baked this morning from batch formed into final loaves on Sunday night. So today's Tuesday. So baked a loaf yesterday morning, 13 hours, which was good, but the loaf baked this morning, 37 hours was best. So why is that? Is that the fermentation time?
Yes. The longer you let it ferment, the better it is. It's the same thing. I mean, a canley is not really a fermentation, but it's all about the resting. It's all about the fermenting. If you have a sourdough loaf that is allowed to rest longer in the fridge, and it will develop much stronger flavors than a sourdough that is made and you let it mix. You let it rest for a couple hours. A little bit of fermentation happens in 2 hours. much more fermentation happens in 24 hours. And the more fermentation, the better the flavor. Yeah?
True. I noticed that one time I fermented a little too long and it kind of broke the structure of my gluten. That can happen if you have a starter that's pretty active, correct?
Yeah, and also the temperature of where you let your dough ferment. Again, it's always about temperature. If you let it ferment in the refrigerator, you can let it ferment for a long time. But if you let it ferment in, let's say, the basement, and then basement is supposed to be cool, and then you come home, it's like something happened, I don't know, and it's warmer, guess what? Your dough is going to rise out of control. Okay, so it's always about fermentation and about temperature.
Yep. Which leads us into the next question from Patricia again. Is there a particular thermometer you recommend to gauge temperature in bread and other baked goods?
Yes.
Baked goods? Is there any? Yeah.
We like to use ThermoWorks. ThermoWorks is the brand, and they're really accurate. And once you use it, they show the temperature very quickly. They have very quick reaction time, and you can change it from Fahrenheit to Celsius. That's the brand that we use because it's very accurate, and it never fails us.
All right. ThermoWorks.
Yes.
All right. A couple more questions here, Chef. How much starter do you discard, and can you do anything with it? So this is from Stephanie, and I've had this question myself because I'm always not wanting to lose my starter, and I've made it into pancakes or waffles. What's your recommendation on how much starter to discard?
Oh, it's all depending on your recipe, but really you don't need more than this much starter at home, because there's no reason to have a huge bucket full of starter. There's no point, right? So to feed it, you're going to take a little bit out. You have to follow the recipe. Every recipes are different, and then you add more flour, more water. And then that little bit, you make whatever you want, like you say, pancakes or whatnot. But if you start with a small amount, you're not wasting a lot. And at the end of the day, I know it's like throwing away Scotty, right? If you don't use it, it's very sad to see you gone down the disposal, but that's life, you know. But at the end of the day, it's just a little bit of flour that goes away. The rest is just water and bubbles, and a little bit of wild yeast. So it's not the end of the day. So, but like you say, make something with it instead of throwing it away. Make pancakes or
pancakes and waffles. I tried that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, two more questions here, Chef. One is from Kate. Since you mentioned it, Chef, is there a possibility you will do a fermentation class in the future? I know you talked about kombucha and lots of other fermentation. Do you feel like
Love it.
doing a short fermentation class that makes sense?
Great idea, Kate.
Excellent. Yep, thanks for bringing that up. I like that too. So I've been doing my own fermentation, lacto fermentation of vegetables, kombucha, kefir,
sauerkraut.
Yep. All right. Last question is from Sue. I purchased 15 molds, cannoli molds from France, but had to choose a size. She chose the middle size, but they're smaller than the ones that we have. Can she use them, or is it better to get the larger ones?
Yeah, size doesn't matter when it comes to cannoli. So you can use a small, medium, or large. It doesn't matter. It just makes you a bigger cannoli. But it's not a problem. And of course, if they are smaller, you bake them slightly less. If they're larger, you bake them slightly more, obviously, but they can all be used. You don't have to worry.
Excellent. Well, that wraps up the questions from our class today. Chef, thanks for a nice hour and a half discussing these details. And until we go again next time,
okay,
enjoy
fantastic.
it. Thank you, Chef.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.